The saxophone bled through the walls of the jazz club like a wounded animal crying out for mercy. Low and mournful, its notes curled through the humid Charleston night, wrapping around the old brick buildings and crawling along the cobblestone streets that glistened under a sky threatening to split open at any moment. The air was thick, the kind of thick that sat on your chest and made every breath feel like you were drinking the atmosphere rather than inhaling it. Spanish moss hung from the oak trees lining the avenue like curtains in a funeral parlor, swaying in a breeze so faint it barely qualified as movement. The street lamps cast amber pools of light that seemed to dissolve at the edges, unable to push back the darkness that pressed in from every direction. It was the kind of night that made you feel like the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, something it had seen 1,000 times before in its centuries of watching human beings make choices they couldn't take back. Somewhere down the block, a door opened and closed, releasing a brief burst of laughter and music before sealing it away again. A couple walked arm in arm beneath a shared umbrella, their silhouettes melting into the shadows between street lamps like ghosts, who had forgotten they were supposed to haunt somewhere else. The jazz club sat on the corner of Beaumont and Trad, a place called the Indigo Room, known to locals as the kind of establishment where the music was always good, the whiskey was always strong, and nobody asked questions about who you were or why you looked like you hadn't slept in 3 days. Its facade was unassuming, just a weathered blue door set into a brick wall with no sign, no marquee, nothing to announce its presence to anyone who didn't already know it was there. But inside, behind that door, the music lived and breathed and pulled people in like a current they couldn't resist. And tonight, standing just outside that door with her hand resting on the iron railing of the steps, Solène Marchand was trying to decide whether she had the energy to go inside or whether she should just keep walking until the city ran out beneath her feet. Solène's body carried the weight of 14 hours the way an old building carries the weight of its own history, stubbornly, silently, with cracks that only showed if you knew where to look. She was still wearing her dance clothes beneath her jacket, a fitted black leotard and wrap skirt that clung to her frame like a second skin. Her calves burned with the particular fire that came from teaching 6 back-to-back classes at the community center on King Street, where she spent her days coaxing movement out of bodies that had forgotten how to trust themselves. There were the morning seniors, a group of 12 women and 3 men over 65 who came for the gentle stretch and flow class, but stayed for the gossip and the sense of belonging. There were the after-school kids, a rotating cast of 7 to 12-year-olds who had more energy than discipline and more talent than they would ever believe. There were the afternoon rehabilitation patients, people rebuilding their bodies after strokes, surgeries, accidents, relearning the language of movement one painful syllable at a time. And then there were the evening adults, women mostly, who came to the contemporary class looking for something they couldn't name. An hour where they could just exist inside the music and let their bodies say the things their mouths couldn't. Solène gave every class everything she had. It was the only way she knew how to teach, the only way she knew how to do anything. Her mother had called it her blessing and her curse in equal measure, this inability to hold anything back, to reserve some part of herself for later. "You pour from an empty cup, baby," her mother used to say. "One day there won't be anything left." Her mother had been dead for 2 years now, breast cancer that had moved through her body like fire through dry wood, consuming everything in its path before anyone could mount a proper defense. Solène had been at her bedside when she passed, holding her hand and humming the melody of a song her mother used to sing while braiding her hair when she was small. The community center job paid almost nothing. Solène supplemented it with private rehabilitation sessions for physical therapy patients referred by a local clinic, work that drew on the anatomy and kinesiology training she had pursued alongside her dance education, as well as 3 years she had spent as a certified nursing assistant in a rehabilitation ward during her late teens, before the Ailey School accepted her on a full scholarship. She still maintained her first aid and emergency response certifications every year, a habit her mother had insisted on. You never know when someone's going to need steady hands, she used to say, and Solenne's hands had always been steady. She also did choreography for a small theater company that could only afford to pay her in exposure and gratitude, and worked occasional weekend shifts at a restaurant on Meeting Street where she waited tables with the kind of graceful efficiency that earned decent tips from tourists who didn't know they were being served by a woman who had once danced on stages in New York, Paris, and Sao Paulo. That life felt like it belonged to someone else now. The scholarships, the company contracts, the reviews that called her transcendent and luminous. She had walked away from that world 3 years ago, come home to Charleston to care for her dying mother, and never gone back. Not because the door had closed, but because she no longer recognized the person who had walked through it. Her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket, and she pulled it out to find a text from her roommate, Odessa. You better not still be at the center. Come home. Eat food. Be a human being. Selene smiled despite herself. Odessa Fairley was the closest thing she had to family now, a former physical therapy patient who had become a friend, then a roommate, then the persistent voice of reason that kept Selene from disappearing entirely into her work. Odessa had undergone spinal surgery 3 years ago that left her temporarily paralyzed from the waist down, and though she had fought her way back to walking with a cane, she understood the body's capacity for both betrayal and redemption in ways that bonded the two women at a frequency most people couldn't hear. But the saxophone was calling to her from behind that blue door, and her body, despite its exhaustion, was responding to it the way it always responded to music, with a hunger that superseded every other need. Just one drink, she told herself. One drink and one song, and then she would go home and be a responsible adult. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The indigo room was half empty, which suited Selene perfectly. The interior was all dark wood and exposed brick, with a long mahogany bar running the length of one wall and a small stage tucked into the far corner where a quartet was playing something slow and aching that she recognized as a Coltrane arrangement. She found a seat at the bar, ordered a bourbon neat, and let the music wash over her like warm water. The bourbon burned going down, but it was the good kind of burn, the kind that reminded you that you were alive and capable of feeling things other than tired. She closed her eyes and let her head sway gently with the music, her fingers tapping against the bar in a rhythm that her conscious mind wasn't directing. The song shifted into something she didn't recognize, something with a walking bass line that made her think of rain on a tin roof. Without fully deciding to do it, Selene slid off her bar stool and moved toward the small open space near the stage that served as a dance floor on busier nights. Tonight it was empty, and she claimed it without hesitation. She didn't perform. She simply moved. Eyes closed, drink abandoned on the bar, her body responding to the music with the unconscious fluency of someone who had been speaking this language since before she could form words. It was movement as meditation, as prayer, as the only form of honest expression she had left after a day of giving everything else away. She didn't notice the man in the wheelchair watching her from the darkest corner of the room. Daeho Kwon had chosen the indigo room for a reason that had nothing to do with the music. He was here because the owner owed him a debt that was 3 months overdue, and Daeho believed in conducting certain conversations in person, where the weight of his presence could do work that phone calls could not. He sat in his wheelchair at a table in the corner, positioned with his back to the wall, an old habit from a life that had taught him the cost of leaving any angle unguarded. The chair was custom-built, titanium frame, matte black, stripped of any feature that might make it look medical or sympathetic. He despised sympathy almost as much as he despised weakness, and he had spent 12 years making certain that the chair projected neither. 12 years since the shooting. 12 years since a bullet intended for his head had found his spine instead, fired by a man who was dead before Daeho's body hit the ground. 12 years of being told what he couldn't do, what he would never do again, by doctors and specialists who looked at his charts and saw limitations where he saw only problems that hadn't been solved yet. He had not walked in 12 years, had not stood, had not climbed, had not felt the ground beneath his feet since he was 26 years old, and foolish enough to believe that the empire his family had built in Busan could be transplanted to American soil without blood being spilled. The blood had been his own, and the lesson had been permanent. But the empire had survived. More than survived. It had flourished under his leadership in ways that his father, now retired and living quietly in a villa outside Gyeongju, had never imagined possible. Daeho ran it all from the chair, and anyone who mistook his seated position for weakness learned their error exactly once. Tae-sung, his most trusted lieutenant, stood 2 steps behind him, close enough to act, but far enough to give the illusion of privacy. They had been discussing the matter of the club owner's debt in low-clipped Korean when the woman appeared on the empty dance floor, and every word Daeho had been about to say evaporated from his mind like mist in sunlight. He had seen dancers before. He had watched technically perfect bodies execute technically perfect movements with technically perfect precision, and he had felt nothing. But this woman was not performing. She was conversing with the music in a language that bypassed technique entirely and went straight to something raw, something true. She moved like grief, like joy, like a woman who had swallowed an ocean and was slowly letting it pour out through her fingertips and the arches of her feet. There was no audience in her mind, no stage, no expectation. Just a body and a song and the space between them, closing and opening like breathing. Daeho's hand tightened on the armrest of his chair, and he felt something stir in his chest that he had not felt in so long. He had almost forgotten what it was. Something closer to recognition. Like watching someone do effortlessly the thing you had spent your whole life trying to accomplish through force and will, and the refusal to accept the word impossible. "Sir," Tae-sung said quietly, "the owner is ready to speak with you." Daeho didn't respond. His eyes never left the woman on the dance floor. The song was ending, and he watched her movements slow, her body settling back into stillness like a leaf coming to rest on the surface of a pond. She opened her eyes, and for one brief, electric moment, her gaze swept across the room and passed over his corner without stopping. She hadn't seen him. She had no idea he existed. And Daeho Kwon, who controlled an empire that spanned 2 continents and answered to no one, found himself experiencing something he hadn't felt since the bullet that changed his life. He wanted to be noticed. "Tell the owner to wait," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not finished here." Daeho Kwon had not built his reputation by being a man who acted on impulse. Every decision he made was the product of calculation. He measured risk the way a jeweler measured gemstones, turning each facet slowly in the light until he understood exactly what he was holding. Impulse was for men who could afford to lose. Daeho had lost enough for several lifetimes. And yet, here he was, watching a stranger dance and telling his most trusted associate to make a man who owed him $600,000 wait. The woman had returned to the bar, sliding back onto her stool with the fluid grace of someone whose body didn't know how to move any other way. She picked up her bourbon, took a sip, and said something to the bartender that made him laugh. "Find out who she is," Daeho said. Tae-sung didn't ask why. He simply produced his phone, stepped back into the shadows near the emergency exit, and began making calls. This was the machinery that operated beneath the surface of Daeho's world. A network of contacts, informants, and associates, who could locate a person's entire history within the span of a single conversation. It was not a power Deho exercised carelessly. Information was currency, and he spent it with the same deliberation he applied to everything else. While Taisung worked, Deho allowed himself to study the room with the tactical awareness that had become second nature. The Indigo Room's owner, a man named Garrett Beauchamp, was somewhere in the back, no doubt sweating through the conversation he knew was coming. Garrett's debt was the result of a business loan Deho had extended 18 months ago. Capital to renovate the club and expand its kitchen. The terms had been generous by Deho's standards, which meant they were merely punishing rather than ruinous. But Garrett had missed 3 consecutive payments, and generosity without enforcement was just weakness wearing a pleasant mask. There were 2 of Deho's men positioned near the front entrance, dressed casually enough to blend with the sparse crowd, but trained enough to respond to any threat within 3 seconds. A third was outside, watching the street. This was the minimum security detail Deho traveled with for routine business. The Kwan family's American operations were centered in Atlanta, where Deho maintained his primary residence and the corporate offices that served as the legitimate face of an empire built on foundations that would not survive close inspection. Import-export, real estate development, private lending. The portfolio was diversified enough to satisfy casual scrutiny and profitable enough to fund the activities that happened in the spaces between the line items. Charleston was a secondary market, a city where Deho maintained interests in commercial property, 2 restaurants, and a growing stake in the port logistics industry that moved goods in and out of the harbor with the kind of efficiency that made certain federal agencies periodically curious. He came here perhaps once a month, sometimes less, always for business and never for pleasure. Pleasure was a concept Deho had largely abandoned after the shooting. Not because he was incapable of it, but because most forms of pleasure required a vulnerability he was no longer willing to extend. The chair had taught him that. Not the physical limitations, but the way people looked at him. The pity that flickered across their faces before they could control it. The unconscious adjustment in their voices. Softer, slower, as if his legs and his mind had been damaged in equal measure. He had learned to weaponize those assumptions. Competitors who underestimated the man in the wheelchair found themselves outmaneuvered before they realized the game had started. The chair was not a prison. It was a throne. And he had made certain that everyone who entered his orbit understood the distinction. Taesung returned, positioning himself at Deho's shoulder. Solène Marchand, 29 years old, lives in the Cannonboro-Elliottboro neighborhood. Dance instructor at the Low Country Community Arts Center on King Street. 6 classes a day, 5 days a week. Also does private rehabilitation sessions and choreography for a local theater. He paused. She used to be professional, trained at the Ailey School in New York, danced with a contemporary company based in Brooklyn for 4 years, toured internationally, Paris, São Paulo, Berlin. Left 3 years ago and came back to Charleston. Her mother died of cancer approximately 2 years ago. No father listed. No siblings. 1 emergency contact, a woman named Odessa Fairley at the same address. Deho absorbed this in silence, a dancer who had walked away from an international career to care for a dying mother. A person who had chosen sacrifice over ambition and worn the consequences without complaint. He understood that kind of choice. He had watched his own mother make it years ago in Busan, when she had surrendered her own dreams to support a husband whose ambitions devoured everything around them. His mother had been a painter and a musician. She played the geum with a tenderness that made the strings sound like they were weeping. She had put her brushes and her instruments away the year Deho was born. He had found hundreds of her canvases in the attic after her death. Landscapes and portraits that glowed with a light he had never seen in her eyes during the years he knew her. "I want to talk to her," Deho said. "Sir, the Beauchamp matter can wait 15 more minutes." His voice was quiet, but the finality in it closed the conversation like a door shutting. Bring her a drink. Tell her it's from the gentleman in the corner who was moved by her dancing. Nothing more. Solène was on her second bourbon when the bartender placed a glass in front of her that she hadn't ordered. It was a pour of something amber and expensive-looking, served in crystal with a single large ice sphere that caught the light like a frozen planet. From the gentleman in the corner, the bartender said. Said he was moved by your dancing. She had a policy about accepting drinks from strangers, but something about the phrasing stopped her. Not impressed by, not interested in, but moved by. It was a word that suggested the person who chose it understood the difference between watching someone dance and actually seeing them. She turned on her bar stool, squinting toward the corner. The table was partially hidden by a support column, and all she could make out was the silhouette of a figure sitting low, much lower than the chairs would typically position someone. There was another man standing nearby, tall and motionless. Tell him thank you, Solène said, and that I'll drink it, but only if he tells me what I was saying. The bartender relayed the message. A moment later, the tall man returned. He says you were saying goodbye to someone. The words hit Solène like a physical blow. Because he was right. She had been thinking of her mother when she danced, the way she always thought of her mother. And the movement that had poured out of her had been exactly that. A goodbye she had never properly said, replayed every time the music gave her permission to feel it again. She picked up the gifted drink and walked toward the corner table. He came into focus gradually. The wheelchair registered first, matte black and angular. Then the man in it. Korean, probably in his late 30s, with a face that was all clean lines and controlled intensity. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, his hands resting on the armrests, long-fingered and still, and his eyes, dark, watchful, missing nothing, tracked her approach, with an attention that felt almost physical. He was beautiful, not in the soft, approachable way that made people comfortable, but in the way that a blade was beautiful. Precise, purposeful, and not entirely safe to handle. You were right, Solène said, stopping at the edge of his table. About what I was saying. How did you know? Because I've said the same goodbye, Daeho replied, and his voice surprised her. Quiet, with a depth that seemed to come from somewhere below his chest. His English was nearly flawless, accented just enough to give certain consonants an edge. Many times, in many different ways, you learn to recognize it in others. Most people just say I'm a good dancer. They don't usually try to read the subtitles. Most people watch with their eyes, Daeho said. I've had 12 years of practice watching with everything else. The statement sat between them, loaded with implication. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Solène, she said, extending her hand. Daeho. His grip was firm and warm and lasted exactly 1 second longer than it needed to. You sent me a drink and a sentence that made me want to cry in a bar full of strangers. The least I could do was find out who's responsible. That earned her something that wasn't quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. So, what have you figured out so far? She asked. That you dance like you're trying to leave your body? Daeho said. Not escape it, but transcend it. Like the physical form is a limitation you keep bumping up against, and the music is the only thing that lets you stretch past it. He paused. I understand that feeling more than you might imagine. His gaze didn't drop to the wheelchair, didn't draw attention to it. He simply let the statement exist, trusting her to hear what he was actually saying. You're either very perceptive or very presumptuous, Solène said. Take your time, I'm not going anywhere. The faintest trace of irony colored the words. I rarely do. She took a sip of the drink and nearly coughed. What is this? Yamazaki 18. I think it's too expensive for me to have an opinion. She set the glass down. So, Daeho, You sit alone in the dark corner of a jazz club, watching strangers dance and sending them whiskey that costs more than my rent. What's your story? Long and not particularly cheerful. Yours? Same, actually. Maybe that's why you could read my dancing. Maybe. He leaned back slightly in his chair, and she noticed the way his hands moved to the wheels with a practiced ease that suggested the chair was as much a part of his body as his arms or his spine. Or maybe some people carry their stories closer to the surface than others, and dancers carry theirs closest of all. The quartet on stage had shifted into something up-tempo, a bright, syncopated number that pulled a few couples onto the floor. Solène watched them for a moment, her body instinctively cataloging their movements. "Do you come here often?" she asked, then immediately grimaced. "God, that sounded like a line. I promise it wasn't." "I'm in Charleston occasionally for business," Dae-ho said. "I usually prefer to conduct my affairs in less atmospheric settings, but the owner of this establishment and I have a relationship that sometimes requires a personal touch." There was something beneath those words, something carefully wrapped in silk that she could feel the edges of but couldn't quite unwrap. The phrases were innocuous enough on their own, but the way he said them, with the measured precision of a man who chose every word the way a sniper chose a vantage point, suggested meanings she wasn't equipped to decode. "You're being very mysterious," Selene said. "Is that deliberate, or is it just how you talk?" "A bit of both. Occupational hazard. I've spent most of my life in rooms where saying too much could get you killed. It makes casual conversations somewhat challenging." "Rooms where saying too much could get you killed," Selene repeated slowly. "And here I thought you were going to say you were a lawyer or an accountant." "Nothing so respectable, I'm afraid." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with the awareness that they had arrived at a boundary. On one side was the pleasant exchange of two strangers enjoying each other's company. On the other was something deeper, more honest, and considerably more dangerous. She should leave. She should finish her drink, thank him for the conversation, and walk out into the Charleston night. Every sensible impulse she possessed was screaming at her to do exactly that. Instead, she leaned forward and said, "Tell me something true. Not something careful, not something strategic. Just one true thing." Dae-ho looked at her for a long moment, and she watched something happen behind his eyes. A wall shifting. A decision being made. "I haven't felt anything in 12 years, he said. "Not really. I've thought and planned and executed and survived, but feeling, the kind that actually reaches the center of you and changes something, I had given up on that entirely." He held her gaze, and the vulnerability in his expression stole the breath from her lungs. "And then you started dancing." "That's a very dangerous thing to say to a stranger," Selene whispered. "I know," Dae-ho said. "I said it anyway." They talked for another hour, then 2. The indigo room emptied around them. They talked about music. Dae-ho told her about the traditional Korean instruments his mother had played. The geum and the haegeum, their sounds woven into his earliest memories. Solène told him about the first time she had heard Miles Davis, how the silence between his notes had taught her more about movement than any choreographer ever had. They didn't talk about his wheelchair, they didn't talk about his business, or the tall man who stood behind him, or why the bartender seemed afraid of him. These were the spaces they navigated around, the furniture in a room they were both pretending was empty. At some point, Selene realized she had forgotten to be tired. She was leaning toward him, her body tilting across the table with the unconscious gravity of someone drawn to a source of warmth. She corrected her posture and caught the flicker in his eyes that said he had noticed both the leaning and the correction. "It's late," she said finally, "nearly 2 in the morning. I should go. Can I offer you a ride home? I can walk. It's not far." He regarded her for a moment, then nodded. "Then at least, let me walk you out." He said it without irony, without any acknowledgement that the verb was technically inaccurate, and something about that refusal to adjust his language struck Selene as profoundly revealing. Outside, the Charleston night had cooled. The humidity had broken, and the air smelled of jasmine and the distant salt tang of the harbor. "Thank you," Selene said, "for seeing what I was saying." "Thank you for saying it," he replied. "It's been a long time since anyone said anything worth hearing." She should ask for his number. She should offer hers. Instead, she smiled, lifted her hand in a small wave, and turned to walk away. By the time she reached her apartment, the hollow feeling had settled into a familiar ache. The same one she carried for her mother, for her career, for every beautiful thing she had lost because she hadn't been brave enough to hold on to it. Odessa was asleep on the couch, the television casting blue light across her face, her cane propped against the armrest. Selene covered her with a blanket and stood in the dark kitchen for a long time, staring out the window. She hadn't asked his last name. She hadn't given him her number. She had walked away because walking away was what she did, the only move she had perfected more thoroughly than any piece of choreography in her entire career. She went to bed telling herself that it was better this way, safer, simpler, and she almost believed it. But her body replayed the night in dreams that felt more like memories. His voice saying, "I haven't felt anything in 12 years." The stillness of his hands on the armrests, the way the guarded darkness in his eyes had softened when she sat down across from him, like a room filling with light through a window that hadn't been opened in a very long time. She woke at 5:30 with the echo of a saxophone in her ears and the unshakable conviction that she had made a terrible mistake. 3 days passed, and Selene threw herself into her work with a ferocity that bordered on self-punishment. She was trying to fill the space that the conversation at the Indigo Room had hollowed out inside her, packing it tight with movement and exhaustion, and the comforting illusion that if she just stayed busy enough, she could outrun the memory of a voice that said, "And then you started dancing." It wasn't working. Odessa noticed. She watched Selene move through their small apartment like a ghost inhabiting its own life, and on the third evening, she planted herself in the kitchen doorway, cane in one hand and the other braced against the frame, and said, "Sit down and tell me what happened, or I'm going to start guessing, and my guesses are always worse than the truth." Selene told her. Not all of it. Not the tall, silent man or the bartender's nervous glances. But enough. "And you didn't get his number," Odessa said flatly. No. Solène Marchand. You met a man who saw exactly who you are, who said things that made your soul vibrate like a tuning fork, and you just walked away into the night like some kind of romantic martyr in a French film. He was dangerous, Odessa. Something about him, about the people around him, told me getting closer would be like standing next to a fire. Baby, you're already cold. You've been cold for 2 years. You work yourself to death. You don't let anyone in. And you dance like you're trying to communicate with the afterlife because the living world has disappointed you too many times. So maybe a little fire isn't the worst thing. On the 4th day, the front desk receptionist appeared in the doorway of Selene's studio. "There's someone here to see you. He says his name is Dae Ho, and he's asking about private sessions." The ground shifted beneath Selene's feet. She finished the class on autopilot and walked to the lobby with a heartbeat so loud she was certain the receptionist could hear it. He was there, in the lobby of the Low Country Community Arts Center in his matte black wheelchair, wearing a dark blue sweater over a collared shirt, looking so thoroughly out of place among the community bulletin boards and children's artwork that the contrast was almost comedic. Taesung was nowhere in sight. "You found me," Selene said. "It wasn't difficult. You told me you taught at a community center on King Street. There's only one." "And the private sessions?" A legitimate inquiry. He met her eyes. I've been told by more doctors than I can count that movement-based rehabilitation could help maintain what function I still have. I've never pursued it, because the people who offered it always looked at me like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be worked with. He paused. You didn't look at me like that. And when you did look, what did you see? I saw someone who was listening harder than anyone I've ever met. Someone who understood what I was saying with my body better than I understood it myself. And I saw someone who has been sitting still for a very long time and wants desperately to move. Will you work with me? He asked. And beneath his controlled surface, she heard something she recognized from her own reflection. A longing so deep it had become structural. Yes, she said. But I need you to be completely honest with me about your injury, your medical history, what you've tried before. I can't help you if you're hiding things. I can do that, Daeho said. In here, with you, I can be honest about this. The qualifier told her everything about the limits of what he was offering. Honesty about his body, his pain, but not about the rest. She accepted the terms because the alternative was walking away again, and she had already learned what that felt like. Monday, 4 o'clock. Bring comfortable clothes and a willingness to feel ridiculous. Daeho's mouth curved into something that was, for the first time, an actual smile. Small, cautious, like a plant unfurling in a room where it wasn't sure there was enough light. My dignity has survived worse. I think it can handle you. At the threshold, he stopped without turning back. Selene. Yes? Thank you for not walking away this time. The sessions began on a Monday in late October, and they changed everything. Daeho was unlike any patient she had ever worked with. He had the discipline of an athlete and the pain tolerance of someone who had long ago decided that suffering was simply a tax the universe charged for existence. He never complained, never asked for breaks. He simply endured with the quiet determination of a man who had been enduring things far worse than hamstring stretches for most of his adult life. What surprised her was the conversation. From the first session, Daeho talked about ideas, observations, questions that revealed a mind so agile that Selene sometimes forgot she was supposed to be guiding him through exercises and found herself simply sitting on the studio floor, listening, while the timer on her phone counted down unnoticed. He asked about her choreographic process. He asked about proprioception and muscle memory. He quoted a Korean poet who had written about the relationship between stillness and motion, and when she asked him to translate, his voice dropped into his mother tongue with a warmth that made the air in the studio feel charged with something that hummed just below the frequency of sound. She learned things about him in fragments. His father had been a powerful man in Busan, whose business interests existed in what Daeho described as the gray areas between commerce and influence. The shooting had happened in Atlanta, during the early days of establishing the American operations. A rival organization, an ambush, a bullet that should have killed him but instead took his legs and left him with a choice: adapt or die. He had adapted. He had rebuilt the organization from his wheelchair, consolidating power through intelligence and strategy, surrounding himself with people whose loyalty was earned through fairness and maintained through the unspoken understanding that Daeho Kwan's mind was more dangerous than any weapon his body could have wielded. He told her these things without self-pity, without drama, without the narrative flourishes that most people used to make their suffering sound more meaningful than it was. He stated facts the way an engineer might describe the structural properties of a material, precisely, objectively, with full awareness of both the strengths and the limitations. Selene reciprocated. She told him about New York, about the phone call that had demolished that life in a single sentence. Your mother has cancer. Come home. She told him about the day after the funeral, when she had tried to dance, and her body had refused. Every joint locked, every muscle frozen, as if grief had turned her to stone. How long? Daeho asked quietly. Before you could move again? 4 months. My body had just stopped. Like it had decided that if it couldn't save her, it wasn't going to do anything at all. Daeho was silent for a long time. I dream about walking, he said. Not every night, but often enough. I'm just standing in a room, feeling the ground under my feet. And when I wake up, and it's gone, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. Their sessions expanded from an hour to 2, then sometimes 3, the clinical framework of patient and therapist dissolving into something more fluid, more honest, and more dangerous. They began meeting outside the studio. Coffee at a small place on Cannon Street that Solène loved for its mismatched furniture, and the owner who remembered everyone's order. Dinners at restaurants where Daeho insisted on choosing the wine, and Solène insisted on arguing with his choices just to watch the expression on his face when someone contradicted him. Taesung was always nearby, a respectful distance away, his presence a constant reminder that the man Solène was sharing dessert with occupied a world where bodyguards were not a luxury, but a necessity. She had stopped asking about Taesung's role, about the other men who sometimes appeared at the edges of their outings like shadows that had detached themselves from the walls. She understood, without being told, that these were questions Daeho could not answer and she was not yet ready to hear the answers to. There were moments that kept her awake at night, turning them over in her mind like stones in a tumbler. The time he reached for her hand during a stretch and held it for 3 full seconds after the exercise was complete, his thumb tracing a line across her palm that she felt for hours afterward. The evening at the coffee shop when he looked at her across the table with an expression so unguarded, she felt as if she were seeing the person he might have been if the world had been kinder. The night he told her, almost as an afterthought while she was packing up her equipment, that her voice was the first sound he listened for when he woke on the mornings they were scheduled to meet. He said it without looking at her, then wheeled himself out of the studio before she could respond. She stood in the empty room, holding a resistance band in one hand and her heart in the other, and understood with perfect, terrifying clarity that she was falling in love with a man whose world could swallow hers whole. And then there was the progress, subtle at first. A twitch in his right quadricep during a stretch. A flicker of sensation in his left foot that he mentioned casually, as if it were an interesting weather observation rather than a potential miracle. The neurologist confirmed what she suspected. His injury was incomplete, the neural pathways damaged but not destroyed, and the targeted movement therapy was slowly coaxing dormant connections back to life. She didn't tell him what she hoped. The cruelty of false hope in spinal cord recovery was something she had witnessed too many times. She kept her observations clinical, her encouragement measured. But she designed her programs around the possibility. Every exercise was quietly engineered to stimulate the pathways that might, given time and persistence and biological luck, give him back what the bullet had taken. And she waited. And she hoped. And she fell deeper into something she couldn't climb out of even if she wanted to. The call came at 11:40 on a Wednesday night. It was Taesung. In 6 months of knowing Daeho, Taesung had never called her. His voice was clipped, controlled. And underneath the control, she heard something that turned her blood to ice. Fear. Miss Marchand, Mr. Kwan needs you. I'm sending a car. Come now. The address led to a warehouse in an industrial district near the port. 2 men she didn't recognize stepped aside without a word when she approached, one holding the door with an expression that hovered between urgency and relief. They were relieved she was here, which meant whoever was inside needed her in a way that went beyond what these men could provide. Daeho was on a table in a room set up as a rudimentary medical station. He was conscious. The relief that flooded through her was so intense it made her knees buckle. His face was ashen, his jaw locked in a grimace. His shirt was gone, and she could see the damage. A deep laceration running diagonally across his left side from his lower ribs to his hip, the edges ragged, made by something serrated. There was blood, significant but not catastrophic, and Tai-sung was pressing a wadded cloth against the wound. "What happened?" Selene demanded, moving to the table, her training taking over. "A disagreement," Daeho said through clenched teeth, "with someone who brought a knife to what was supposed to be a conversation. The cut was deep but had missed anything vital. No arterial spray, no organ involvement. Survivable, provided it was properly cleaned and closed. This needs a hospital," she said. "No hospital. They'll file a police report, and the questions that follow will cause more damage than the wound. If this gets infected, then you'll treat the infection." His eyes found hers, and beneath the pain she saw complete, unreserved trust. "You're the only person in this room I trust. Please." This was the line she had known was coming, the boundary between the world she understood and the world he inhabited. Crossing it meant becoming complicit in something she couldn't fully see, couldn't control, and couldn't undo. Staying on this side meant walking away from a man who was bleeding on a table and looking at her like she was the only fixed point in a universe that had gone dark. She thought of her mother, of the night she had sat in the hospice room and made the decision to stop treatment, to let the woman she loved more than anything slip away because continuing to fight would only prolong suffering without offering hope. That had been the hardest choice of her life. This one was different. This one had consequences she couldn't calculate. "Everyone out," she said quietly. "Taesung, I need hot water, clean towels, and the strongest alcohol you have. Not for drinking, for cleaning." Taesung looked at Daeho, who nodded once. The room cleared in seconds. She worked for 2 hours. She cleaned the wound with a thoroughness that made Daeho grip the edges of the table so hard she heard the metal creak. She closed it with the suture kit she found among the supplies. Her stitches small and even, learned years ago from a surgical nurse at the rehabilitation ward who had taught her on pigskin during slow night shifts. She dressed it with layers of gauze and adhesive, applied pressure, checked for continued bleeding, monitored his pulse and breathing and the color of his skin with the obsessive attention of someone who understood that the margin between survival and catastrophe could be measured in minutes. Daeho didn't make a sound throughout. Not a gasp, not a groan. He simply lay there, eyes fixed on the ceiling, breathing controlled with the discipline of a man who had made an art form out of refusing to show weakness. When it was done, Solène sat down heavily in a folding chair, her hands trembling with the adrenaline crash. "You could have died," she said, and her voice cracked. "You could have died tonight, and I would have found out from Taesung calling me to come look at a body instead of a patient." "Solène, don't. Don't rationalize this to me. I just sewed your body shut with a suture kit in a warehouse at 1 in the morning. I've earned the right to be honest. You have. You've earned that, and more. Then hear me. Whatever this is between us, the coffee dates and the sessions and the conversations about poetry and movement, it can't survive this. Not like this. I can't love someone and spend every night wondering if the next phone call ends everything." The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Love. She had said it. Not softly over dinner or breathlessly after a kiss, but standing over him in a warehouse with his blood drying on her hands. Daeho looked at her with an expression she had never seen. Not surprise. Recognition. As if she had finally said aloud something he had been carrying in silence for months. "You love me," he said, and it was not a question. "God help me," Selene whispered. "Yes." Solène insisted on monitoring his recovery at his penthouse apartment. A space that was vast, minimalist, furnished with restrained elegance. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the harbor, and the walls held exactly 3 pieces of art. A small oil canvas in the hallway stopped her in her tracks. It was a painting of hands. A woman's hands, mid-gesture, frozen in a moment that could have been the beginning or the end of a movement. The brushwork was luminous. My mother painted that, Daeho said from behind her. It's the only one of hers I kept. She painted hundreds, but this one, she said, was about the space between holding on and letting go. She said the most important things in life happen in that space. They didn't discuss her confession. It lived between them, acknowledged but untouched. She changed his bandages daily, her fingers gentle against his skin, and he watched her work with an intensity that made her hands tremble if she thought about it too hard. On the 7th day, she brought her portable speaker to his apartment. "What are you doing?" "Something I should have done months ago." She found a piece by a Korean-American composer built around the gyeogyum, the instrument his mother had played. Its strings plucked in patterns that wove between traditional Korean melody and contemporary jazz harmony. Layered beneath it was a bass line that moved like breathing, slow and deep and impossible to resist. The music filled the apartment, and Selene watched Daeho's face transform. The controlled lines softened. Something behind his eyes opened like a window she hadn't known was shuttered, and for a moment she saw the man he had been before the bullet, before the chair, before the empire. "Dance with me," she said. The room went very still. Selene, I can't. I didn't ask if you could. I asked you to." She moved toward him, extending her hand palm up. "Trust me. The way I trusted you when Taesung called me to that warehouse. Trust me with this." He looked at her hand for a long time. Something inside him was breaking, not violently, but slowly, gently, the way ice yields in spring, not shattering, but melting, becoming something it had been all along but had forgotten how to be. He took her hand. She began to move. Not her feet, but her hand, guiding his arm through the air in a slow arc that followed the melody. She choreographed their connection through touch, sweeping gestures that used his arms, his shoulders, his torso, and the parts of his body that had always been capable of grace but had never been given permission to express it. He was dancing, not with his legs, but with everything else, with his hands and his breath, and an expression that had shed every mask until there was nothing left but the raw ache of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be inside a moment of beauty rather than observing it from the outside. The song shifted, the gyeogyum climbing into a passage that felt like sunrise. Selene was behind him now, her hands on his shoulders, and she felt something happening beneath her palms. A tremor, not weakness or pain, something neurological, as if his body were remembering a language it had been forbidden to speak. "Daeho," she whispered, "your legs." His right quadricep was contracting, a rhythmic pulse that synchronized with the music, and his left foot was pressing against the footrest of his chair with a force that shouldn't have been possible. "Don't think about it," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Don't analyze it, just stay in the music. Stay with me." She moved to face him, taking both his hands, and pulled gently. Not to lift him. An invitation. A possibility. She could see the war inside him. 12 years of being told no, of building an identity on what he could not do, battling against the terrifying signal his body was sending. His arms shook, his jaw clenched, and his eyes were locked on hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world disappear. "Dance with me," Selene whispered again. And Daeho Kwon, who had not stood in 12 years, who had been told by 7 specialists across 4 countries that the damage was permanent, who had built an empire from a chair and convinced himself that the chair was all he would ever need, pressed his feet against the floor, tightened his grip on the hands of the woman who had stumbled into his life through the door of a jazz club on a humid Charleston night, and rose. It was not graceful. It was not steady. His legs trembled violently, his weight pitched forward, and Selene caught him, bracing herself with every ounce of strength her dancer's frame possessed. He was taller than she had imagined, his face suddenly above hers, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stood for 11 seconds. 11 seconds during which the music played and the harbor light streamed through the windows, and two people held each other in the space between holding on and letting go. Then his legs gave way, and she guided him back into the chair. He sat breathing hard, staring at his own legs as if they belonged to a stranger who had just introduced themselves after a 12-year absence. "That happened?" he said, barely audible. "That happened." He looked up at her, and she saw something she would carry for the rest of her life. It was not gratitude, though gratitude was there. It was not love, though love was there too. It was wonder. Pure, unfiltered, childlike wonder. The expression of a man who had built his life around the certainty that some doors never reopened, and who had just watched one swing wide. "You did that," he said. "You brought me back." "No," Selene said, kneeling beside his chair and taking his face in her hands. "You did that. I just gave you the music." She kissed him. Or he kissed her. Later, neither could remember who moved first, and it didn't matter, because the kiss was not a beginning or an ending but a continuation. The natural next note in a melody that had been building since a saxophone bled through the walls of the Indigo Room, on a night when neither of them had been looking for anything but a moment of peace. The weeks that followed were the most luminous of Selene's life and the most fragile. Daeho's progress continued. He could stand for 30 seconds, then a minute, then 3. He took his first step on a Thursday morning in December. One single, shaking, magnificent step that sent Taesung turning away to press his hand against his eyes in a gesture Solène pretended not to see. But the world Daeho inhabited did not pause for personal transformation. The first sign came on a Saturday evening. Selene noticed a car parked across from the community center. Dark blue, windows tinted, engine off, angled toward the entrance with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with parking convenience. She mentioned it to Daeho that evening. The softness vanished from his face instantly, replaced by the hard, calculating expression she remembered from their earliest encounters. He made 3 phone calls in rapid Korean, and within an hour Taesung arrived with information that turned the evening to ash. The Yoon Syndicate, a rival organization based in Los Angeles that had been encroaching on Daeho's territory for months, testing boundaries, probing defenses, looking for the gap in his armor that would allow them to strike. They had found it. "They know about you," Daeho said, and the way he said it, quietly, carefully, as if the words themselves were dangerous, told Selene everything she needed to know about what that knowledge meant. "They've been watching you for at least 2 weeks. They know where you work, where you live, and your daily routines. They know about Odessa." The mention of Odessa's name sent a spike of ice through Selene's chest so sharp it felt like a physical wound. "What do they want?" "Leverage," Daeho said. "They want me to know that the person I care about most in this world is within their reach. It's a negotiating tactic. A threat wrapped in patience." "What are they negotiating for?" "Control of the port logistics operation. It's worth more than everything else I run in this city combined, and they want it. They see you as the pressure point that will make me concede." Selene sat down on the edge of the couch, her mind racing through implications that branched and multiplied like cracks in glass. She thought of Odessa, sleeping peacefully in their apartment, unaware that her name had been spoken in rooms where violence was a dialect everyone was fluent in. She thought of her students at the community center, the seniors and the children, and the rehabilitation patients who came to her seeking healing, and had no idea that their teacher had entangled herself with a man whose enemies drew no distinction between targets and collateral damage. "What do we do?" she asked, and the "we" was deliberate. A declaration that she was not going to run, not going to fracture under the pressure, not going to give his enemies the satisfaction of watching his armor crack. Daeho looked at her with an expression she had seen only once before, the night she had sewn his wound shut in the warehouse. The look of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for every contingency and had never once prepared for someone who would choose to stand beside him in the fire rather than flee from it. "I can protect you," he said. "I can put security on you, on Odessa, on the community center. I can make you untouchable." For how long? A month? A year? What about the next threat? And the one after that? Selene shook her head. "Protection isn't a solution, Daeho. It's a bandage on a wound that needs surgery." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that the man who stood up from a wheelchair after 12 years because he was brave enough to try might be brave enough to try something else." She knelt beside his chair and took his hands. "You told me you built all of this because it was the only way you knew how to survive. But you're not just surviving anymore. You're living. For the first time in 12 years, you're actually living. And I'm asking you whether the life you're building with me is worth more than the empire you built without me." "There's a way," Daeho said slowly. "I've been thinking about it for weeks. I can transfer the port operations to a legitimate management structure, restructure the organization. The pieces that are clean stay clean. The rest get dismantled or handed off. It would take months, and it would mean giving up everything my father built. Can you do that? Walk away from something like this?" He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw wonder and fear, the impossible becoming possible. "Ask me to dance," he said quietly. "What?" "Ask me the way you asked me that day, when everything changed." She searched his face and understood. He wasn't asking her to dance. He was asking for the same invitation, to attempt something everyone believed he couldn't do. "Dance with me," she whispered. "Yes," Daeho said. And the word was not about movement. It was about everything. 6 months later, on a warm Charleston evening in June, Selene stood on the stage of the Low Country Community Arts Center and watched the audience filter into borrowed seats. The center's small performance space had been transformed. Fairy lights across the ceiling, fresh flowers in mason jars, a sound system donated by someone whose name she didn't ask about. It was the center's first annual showcase. The seniors performed a group piece set to Etta James. The children choreographed their own hip-hop number. 3 minutes of barely controlled chaos and pure joy. The rehabilitation patients demonstrated their progress in a segment titled "Still Moving." And the finale belonged to her and Daeho. She had choreographed it over weeks, a duet that told their story without words. It began with her dancing alone, fluid and beautiful but incomplete, a body searching for something it couldn't find. Then the music shifted, and Daeho entered from the side in his wheelchair, and their movements interweaved, her standing, him seated, their hands finding each other across the space between their different planes. The audience didn't know what they were about to see. Even Odessa, in the front row with tears already forming, didn't know. The music changed one final time, the Gaiagium. The same piece from the first time he stood. Selene extended her hand, and the room fell silent with the particular quality of silence that meant every person could feel something extraordinary gathering like static before lightning. Daeho took her hand. He placed his feet on the stage floor, and slowly, with the hard-won strength of months of work and the grace of a man who had finally stopped fighting his own body and started listening to it, he stood. The gasp from the audience was a single collective breath. Odessa's hands flew to her mouth. Taesung, against the back wall, closed his eyes. Daeho stood and he stepped forward, and Selene caught him, and they moved together in a pattern that was not quite walking and not quite dancing, but something in between. Something new, something that belonged only to them, a vocabulary invented by two people who had spent their lives learning different languages and had finally found the one they shared. It lasted less than a minute. His legs trembled, and she guided him back to the chair with the seamless partnership of two bodies that trusted each other completely. But in those 40 or 50 seconds of impossible, imperfect, magnificent movement, something had been proven that went beyond the physical. That the chair was not the end of the story, that the bullet was not the final word, that a woman who had lost everything and a man who had built everything could meet in a jazz club on a humid night and create something neither of them could have created alone. The audience erupted, but Selene barely heard it. She was looking at Daeho, and he was looking at her. And in his eyes she saw every moment that had brought them here. The saxophone, the whiskey, the warehouse, the first step, the fear, the choice, the surrender that was not a surrender at all, but the bravest thing either of them had ever done. "Thank you," he said, and the words were so small for everything they contained. "For what?" "For hearing the music," he said, when I had forgotten it was playing. Outside the community center, the Charleston night was warm and alive with the sounds of a city that had spent centuries watching people arrive at the shores of impossible decisions and choose, against all reason, to step forward anyway. The harbor lights danced on water that remembered everything and judged nothing, and somewhere in the distance, a saxophone was playing.